At night after dinner, someone knocked on the door. Bikasai opened the door and said someone was delivering a package for Sharon. Sharon was confused because she didn't feel any message, but the courier was sure that the package was indeed for Sharon. From the address on the box, it was indeed the address of Revan's house where Sharon now lived. However, there was no name of the sender.
Sharon was suspicious, fearing something strange.
In the end, Sharon received the package and opened it in the living room. Sharon reread the address and her name as the recipient, and it was true. It was the name as well as the address where she lived now. Sharon was scared at first. It was something dangerous. But after opening it, Sharon got 2 photos with beautiful frames. Sharon's brows furrowed, trying to recognize the people in the photos. After a while, Sharon began to recognize who was in the photo. Underneath the 2 photos, there was a piece of paper with writing on it. Sharon unfolded the paper and began to read the contents. "I leave this to you for my children. Because of you, they can't have complete parents anymore. So at least they can see this memorable photo as a cure for their longing." Sharon squeezed the paper tightly. Her eyes began to tear up as she looked at the photo. It was a childhood photo of Vano and Vien together with Revan and Dilla. The 4 of them were smiling happily. Sharon wasn't angry to see that, but she felt hurt by the contents of Dilla's letter. Dilla wrote those words as if she thought that Sharon was blocking Vano and Vien's happiness to have intact parents again.
"Whose package is it, Bun?"
Vano and Vien came over because Sharon hadn't returned to the dining room. She had been clearing the dining table. Sharon didn't answer, handing the photos to Vano and Vien. She forced a smile, trying to hide her tears that were about to fall.
"Keep them well. Don't get damaged or lost,"
Sharon said. After Vano and Vien received the photos, Sharon cleared the rubbish and took them to the kitchen. She quickly wiped the corners of her wet eyes. Don't let Revan see it like this. Vano and Vien were initially confused because the package for Sharon was delivered to them. But after scrutinizing the photos, Vano and Vien understood.
"Who sent this?" asked Vien incredulously.
Vano was silent for a moment, then ran to the kitchen. He didn't find Sharon there, but Vano headed straight for the rubbish bin. Picking up the package just now, he found a crumpled paper. Slowly, Vano opened the paper. Vien, who was beside him, read the handwriting on the paper.
And ended with an annoyed squeal when he found out who sent the photo just now.
"Why is Mama always looking for trouble?"
Vano asked himself. He rubbed his forehead, thinking about his mother's behavior in disrupting his father's household.
"If it continues like this, Mom will continue to feel guilty about us,"
Vien muttered.
Vano threw the paper away and ruffled his hair in frustration. "Tomorrow we have to meet Mom. Warn Mama not to bother Papa and Mom anymore. Don't let Mama's interference make Mom think of bad things,"
said Vano. Vien nodded in agreement. They didn't want to be one of the causes of their father's household cracking. So, they must act to restrain and stop their biological mother's outrageous behavior. Sharon was lazy to think about everything related to Dilla, but she also kept thinking about the photos and letters sent by Dilla earlier.
Sharon felt guilty for Vano and Vien.
Because it could be, she did block the 2 children's desire to have intact parents again. Sharon was confused about what steps to take. It could be that Vano and Vien's kind gesture of accepting her was just a formality, out of respect for Revan. It could be that their hearts are not willing when their father has another woman besides their biological mother. Even though Revan is not actually their biological father, it is still Revan who has become a father figure for Vano and Vien. Sharon became brooding and dreamy. Revan certainly noticed something odd about his wife's behavior after dinner last night. Revan did not know that Sharon had received a package, because when the courier came, Revan had entered the room first.
"Something on your mind?"
Revan asked as he sat beside Sharon. Sharon looked at her husband and smiled softly. She shook her head softly in response. Revan's hand touched Sharon's cheek gently, staring intently at his wife's eyes that looked troubled and sad at the same time.
The look in her eyes could not deceive Revan. "Was there a problem with the children when I entered your room?"
asked Revan, trying to find information.
Sharon quickly shook her head, not wanting Revan to think badly of her twins.
No, Moss. I'm fine, Cock.
Sharon tried to reassure her husband. Sharon pulled Revan to lie down with her, and Sharon immediately hugged Ren's body tightly, leaning against her husband's broad chest. Her eyes were closed, listening to the rhythmic beating of her husband's heart. Ah, would she be able to give up and lose Revan, who had filled the entire space of her heart?
If there's something, tell me. Don't keep it to yourself.
Revan said as he gently stroked Sharon's hair. Sharon did not respond and remained silent. She had a lot to consider before telling Revan about Dilla. Revan's hand moved, touching Sharon's stomach and rubbing it lightly. It made Sharon open her eyes, then look up at her husband.
I hope you can get pregnant soon. I want to have another child.
Revan said. There was great hope in his eyes, and it made Sharon feel tight inside. Could she destroy that hope just because of Dilla's interference? No, she couldn't.
She couldn't give up.
She had Revan to fight for.
She didn't want to lose him.
Day by day, Sharon always carries out her obligations as a wife and a mother. Dilla's interference is still frequent. However, Vano and Vien begged Sharon to ignore all the interference from their mother. They swear that they are now more comfortable living with Sharon, who is a birth mother, than living with their biological mother. Because of this, Sharon gained the strength to ignore all the interference from Dilla. If Sharon went home from college and stopped somewhere, there was always someone to accompany her. If her husband couldn't accompany her, then there was Vano or Vien who accompanied her. Vano and Vien had agreed to look after Sharon when she was out of the house, making sure Sharon avoided accidentally meeting their biological mother. As a wife, Sharon must also obey her husband's orders. For example, Revan's order forbade her from using any type of contraception. Raven's desire to have his own children, his own flesh and blood, is very strong. That doesn't mean forgetting the fact about Vano and Vien, but Revan still wants to have a child, his own flesh and blood. Sharon had to obey, despite her fears that she would get pregnant before graduation. However, Sharon was sure it wouldn't be a problem. 3 months into her marriage with Revan, Sharon tested positive for pregnancy. It all started when Sharon fainted in the campus canteen. Panicked, Vano and Vien immediately took their mother to the nearest hospital. And after being examined, the doctor said the shocking news. Namely, the news of Sharon's pregnancy, which is about 7 weeks old. Don't ask how happy Sharon and Revan were when they found out that their love child was now in Sharon's stomach. Vano and Vien are also happy because soon they will have a little brother. After being declared pregnant, Revan treated Sharon even better and more special. Sharon did not fail to get attention from her husband, making Sharon feel like the luckiest wife. Like today, Sharon is experiencing morning sickness. Since early morning, she has been vomiting. Her body felt weak because no food was coming in. Every time she tried to eat, Sharon would immediately spit it out.
She had a difficult craving period.
Because of this, the doctor advised Sharon to be treated at the hospital. Without waiting any longer, Revan immediately took Sharon to the hospital. When she arrived at the hospital, Sharon immediately received good treatment. Her face was pale and her body looked weak. Revan couldn't bear to see his wife's condition so weak now.
Moss, I'm sorry to trouble you.
Sharon spoke weakly. Revan had been faithfully accompanying her since earlier, holding her hand tightly, giving her strength.
No one should feel inconvenienced. It's my duty to take care of you.
Revan replied. One hand moved to gently rub Sharon's head, giving a smile that made Sharon feel calm and comfortable.
Staying a few days in the hospital was indeed very boring for Sharon.
However, this was all important for her, as well as for her future baby. Even so, she also had to take a few days off from classes until she was completely healthy. Returning from college, Vano and Vien and their girlfriends came to the hospital intending to see Sharon. Renata brought milk and biscuits for pregnant women, while Novi brought fruits. Hopefully, Sharon will recover and be able to enjoy what they brought. When they were almost at the door of Sharon's hospital room, The four of them stopped walking. Renata and Novi looked at each other for a moment, then looked at their respective girlfriends.
"Isn't that your mum?"
asked Novi cautiously.
In front of the door, Dilla stood as if peering inside.
Vano let out a rough breath, immediately approaching the woman who had given birth to him.
Dilla was stunned when Vano grabbed her arm quite roughly. Not wanting the argument to be heard in the room, Vano pulled Dilla away from there. Vien told Novi and Renata to go in first and asked them not to tell Revan or Sharon about Dilla's presence. Meanwhile, he immediately followed Vano. Vano took Dilla to the park beside the hospital building. He let go of his mother's hand and looked at his mother with annoyance.
What are you doing here? To peek into Sharon's room?
Vano asked seriously. His eyes were so sharp looking at Dilla, who was misbehaving because she was caught peeping.
Mama just wanted to see your stepmother.
Dilla replied. Vano looked at her closely, and the look in her eyes lied. Vano took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. He didn't want to be a disobedient son, but his mother's behavior always provoked Vano's anger and sometimes made him lose control.
Ma, Vano and I have repeatedly told Mama not to appear in front of Papa and Sharon. Why didn't you do it?
Vien, who had just arrived, immediately asked a question in an exasperated tone.
You had good intentions, but why are you guys being like this to me? It's true that that woman has poisoned your minds.
Ma, stop. Don't keep blaming Sharon. You're the one who's always looking for trouble.
Vano exclaimed in annoyance.
Vano, you dare to yell at Mum for defending that woman. You're so insolent.
Cluck. Vano held his cheeks and looked at his mum in disbelief. Vien's eyes widened at the sight of his mother slapping Vano.
Ma!
Vien exclaimed, and tried to hold back Dilla's hand that wanted to slap Vano again.
You're all the same. You don't respect your mum who has worked hard to give birth to you. Now you're defending other women more than your own mother.
Vano and Vien closed their eyes, trying not to be provoked. They didn't want to lose control and be rude to their mothers in public.
Mom made me and Vano choose this path. Please, Ma, introspect yourself. Vano and I wouldn't have prioritized Sharon over Mama if there wasn't a reason.
Vien said, keeping his tone low.
Please, Ma, go home. Don't make trouble here. Sharon is not well and your arrival will only make the situation worse and worse. Thank you for your good intention to see how Sharon is doing. But you should not meet Sharon or Papa. This is for everyone's sake, May. We beg you once again, don't keep doing things that make us even angrier at Mama.
Vien whispered. Vano and Vien looked at Dilla for a long time. Despite the anger in their hearts, they tried to remain polite.
They took Dilla's hand and kissed the back of her hand reverently.
Then they both stepped into the hospital, leaving Dilla alone there. Days passed and Sharon recovered. Her difficult cravings have passed. Now she rarely experiences morning sickness.
The nausea and vomiting are still there, but not too severe.
Sharon's pregnancy is now 10 weeks old. In this first trimester of pregnancy, Sharon still experiences cravings, wanting different types of food according to her mood. It's not just Revan who is bothered. His 2 stepchildren are also bothered when Sharon wants a food that is suddenly difficult to obtain. Sometimes Vano and Vien complained to their grandmother when Sharon asked for something, and they went around looking for it but couldn't find it. But Cinta tried to encourage them.
Think of it as training. It's better if your wife's cravings aren't as severe as Sharon's. What if it's worse?
That's what Cinta always says to her 2 grandchildren. Luckily, they were not angry and understood what she meant. True, one day they will also have wives and will definitely go through this phase.
So, think of it as practicing patience with a pregnant woman.
Today, around 10 Sharon wanted to eat chicken soup at the restaurant of her choice. Because Revan was called by Darren for a meeting, he could not accompany his wife. Finally, Vano and Vien were the ones who accompanied Sharon. Coincidentally, they didn't have any classes. Meanwhile, Sharon's 2 best friends had to go to college. Sharon chose a restaurant not too far from campus. She couldn't wait for her order to arrive.
I'm sorry. I'm troubling you again.
Sharon said, feeling bad. She was the one who was pregnant, but Vano and Vien had to be bothered by it.
No need to apologize. It's not a hassle either.
Vien replied. He and Vano smiled, making Sharon feel relieved.
You guys, graduation is in how many months?
Sharon asked Vano and Vien, who were sitting opposite her.
In 5 months, if I'm not mistaken.
Vano answered. Vien seemed to count, then nodded, confirming Vano's answer.
After graduation, are you going to continue your master's degree or work?
It looks like we'll be working right away, Bun. Papa has prepared a job for us. So, both of us will work in Papa's company. We might even replace Darren after he retires.
Vano replied. Sharon smiled broadly at that. She was always happy to hear about everything Revan was preparing and doing for Vano and Vien. It was a sign that Revan really loved them both.
Hopefully, you will graduate with satisfactory grades,
Sharon said. Vano and Vien nodded and smiled, thanking Sharon for her prayers. Their conversation was interrupted when the waiter came to deliver their food. Sharon looked very happy and the waiter served her order. However, Sharon's eyes were immediately drawn to Vano's fried rice that looked so delicious. Vano noticed Sharon's gaze and he smiled understandingly. Aren't pregnant women like that?
Bun, want some of this fried rice?
Asked Vano. Sharon nodded slowly.
Yes, I'll just order it. It looks really good,
Sharon replied. She was about to call the waiter, but Vano forbade her. He immediately swapped his food and Sharon's, which were both untouched.
Just swap them. I'm afraid I won't run out if I order more.
Vano said. Sharon smiled and thanked him again. When she saw Vano's fried rice, her desire to eat chicken soup vanished. Perhaps there are those who are like that. Luckily, Vano wasn't upset at her behavior. In fact, his stepson was kind enough to exchange their food. Just an hour after Sharon returned home, she received a call from Renata that Vano had been hospitalized. Sharon was very surprised to learn about it. She immediately ordered an online taxi and headed to the hospital. She also told Revan, who was still at the company. When they arrived at the hospital, Vien and Novi sat in the waiting chair with worried faces. Meanwhile, Renata walks back and forth like an iron because she is panicking about Vano's condition inside, who is being examined by the doctor. Revan arrives next and immediately asks what happened. Sharon rubbed his arm, trying to calm her husband even though she was worried herself.
What happened to Vano?
Asked Revan. The worry was evident in his eyes. Vien shook his head, a sign that he didn't understand either.
During class earlier, Vano took permission to go back and forth to the toilet, to the point that a friend found him unconscious near the toilet.
Vien answered with a trembling voice. Revan and Sharon's brows furrowed at that. Before Revan could ask another question, the doctor came out of Vano's room. They suddenly walked up to the doctor.
What happened to my son, Doc?
Revan asked impatiently.
After we examined him, he lost quite a lot of fluid, causing dehydration due to frequent urination. Perhaps he ate something that caused him to have an upset stomach,
the doctor said. Vien's eyebrows shot up at that.
But he didn't eat anything, Doc. When we had lunch, he was still fine.
Vien said, confused. After a few seconds, Vien and Sharon locked eyes. The last meal Vano had consumed was Sharon's ordered chicken soup, which was finally eaten by Vano.
Perhaps someone put in a large dose of laxatives. For the time being, the patient must be treated,
the doctor said again. Vien and Sharon were silent hearing that. Was Vano poisoned from the chicken soup earlier?
Doc, can laxatives abort a pregnancy?
Asked Vien in a trembling voice. Now everyone there immediately looked at Vien in confusion.
If consumed in large quantities without a doctor's advice, it can indeed cause a miscarriage.
The doctor's answer made Sharon's body weak. She almost fell down, if only Revan hadn't swiftly embraced her. Sharon immediately clutched her own stomach. She had no idea that her desire to eat lunch earlier had almost killed her future baby. After the doctor left, Revan finally interrogated Vien. He sat a limp Sharon on the waiting chair.
Staring at Vien, he asked Vien to tell him everything.
Finally, with a trembling voice, Vien recounted what had happened at the restaurant. About the chicken soup and fried rice that were swapped because Sharon wanted Vano's fried rice. Nothing was strange until finally the problem occurred when they were already on campus. Van, who panicked, immediately thought badly of Sharon. However, Sharon also looked shocked. There was no way Sharon would want to harm Vano by deliberately exchanging food that had been laced with laxatives. However, Vien immediately remembered one thing. He immediately asked his father to go with him to the restaurant to find the truth.
You wait here. Mas and Vien will try to find out the truth.
Revan whispered. Sharon nodded weakly. Revan then walked out of the hospital with Vien. He didn't want to be prejudiced, but Vien suspected that the woman who had given birth to him was involved. He certainly knew very well how Dilla had been trying to bully Sharon all this time. Meanwhile, Revan didn't know because Dilla was bothering Sharon behind Revan's back. So Revan didn't have any bad thoughts about his ex-wife. Revan sat side by side with Vien. In front of them, there was a woman who had been a part of Revan's life and would always be someone who had an important status to Vien. She was Dilla. After searching the restaurant, the manager refused to have the waiter examined because there was no order from the police. Finally, Revan and Vien reported to the police first, and the case was immediately dealt with. The restaurant manager inevitably had to take responsibility for the mistake of one of his waiters. After being pressed for a long time, the waiter finally confessed that someone had asked him to put laxatives in the chicken soup Sharon had ordered. When Vien showed her the photo of her mother on her mobile phone, the waitress admitted that the woman had paid for it. Inevitably, the waitress was fired. Initially, Vien would not sue the waitress. However, Revan was against it. He demanded that the waitress be jailed. If not, Revan was worried that the waiter would do the same thing. Even if it was just an order, it was certainly a mistake because it could cause harm to others. Unimaginably, if Sharon and Vano had not swapped their food, it would have been Sharon who would have been in a very dangerous situation because she was pregnant. After being arrested by the police, Dilla denied that he did any of this. Instead, she tried to reverse the facts, saying that Sharon was the one who did it all on purpose.
Revan, it could have been your wife who deliberately told the waiter to put laxatives in her food. Then she acted to be able to exchange her food with Vano. She must have also threatened the waiter to shift the blame onto me.
Dilla's explanation was quite plausible, but Revan and Vien didn't believe her, especially Vien, who knew very well that his mother had always tried to annoy Sharon.
Mum, if Sharon really had bad intentions, it should have been me who was poisoned, not Vano, because I was the one who made a mistake to her. Whereas Vano has always been on her side from the start. If Sharon has a grudge, it should be me, not Vano.
Vien replied against Dilla's explanation. His face was already red, feeling upset and angry at his mother. Dilla was silent at that. She adjusted her hair, looking agitated. Vien exhaled slowly at that. From her gestures, it was obvious that her mother had planned the crime.
It was lucky that the soup was eaten by Vano. If Sharon had eaten it, then Mama would have killed an innocent Fotis, and she did it all for her own ego.
Vien said. His eyes glazed over, unable to believe everything his mother had done.
I won't drop the charges. You put your own son in the hospital. I think you deserve to be punished for what you've done.
Revan said coldly. They were now at the police station. Dilla will be detained until the trial. Revan stood up and walked out of the room, leaving Vien with the woman who gave birth to him.
Can I say something, Ma?
Vien asked. Dilla was silent, but could not escape her son's gaze.
I'm ashamed to have a mother like Mama,
Vien said with trembling voice. Dilla's eyes widened at that. Without further ado, Vien walked out of there, leaving the shocked mother alone. Vien wiped away his own tears, and Revan saw that.
I'm sorry, Papa can't provide any leniency for your mother,
Revan said, feeling guilty. Vien shook his head softly at that.
That's okay. Hopefully Mama will change once she gets her punishment.
Vien replied. He didn't know how long Dilla would be punished, but no matter how long the punishment was, Vien hoped it would open his mother's eyes, to no longer interfere with Revan and Sharon's household. Sharon and Vano clasped each other's hands tightly. They still didn't expect this to happen, and Vano felt lucky that he was the one who ate the chicken soup. if Sharon had eaten it, bad things would have happened. Moreover, the doctor said that laxatives in large doses could indeed cause miscarriage.
Vano, I'm sorry. We shouldn't have swapped food,
Sharon whispered, feeling guilty. Vano, who had regained consciousness, only smiled a little. His body did feel weak from losing a lot of fluid.
But he had received treatment until everything got better.
It's not Mum's fault. There's no need to apologize. In fact, I'm grateful that you didn't eat the chicken soup. I can't imagine how sad Papa would be if something bad happened to you.
Vano replied. Sharon chuckled at that. She was still amused when Vano and Vien called her mother. Her grip on Vano grew tighter, feeling so happy that she was respected by Vano and Vien.
Thank you. I feel so grateful that you and Vien are so kind and respect me so much. I feel like I'm a very lucky woman.
Vano laughed softly at that. Actually, sometimes he still wondered, is this all true? Sharon, who was originally her lover's best friend, then became her friend, is now her stepmother. However, Vano did not regret what had happened. His father's happiness with Sharon makes Vano know that Sharon is indeed the right person to be his father's life companion. And again, Vano always saw Sharon's efforts to do the best for him and Vien. So, what's there to regret?
Papa and Vien aren't back yet?
Vano asked. Sharon shook her head. Since leaving this afternoon, Revan and Vien had not returned to the hospital.
That means they did immediately investigate the case that happened to Vano.
Let it be. Hopefully they will find the culprit soon.
Yes. Renata sends her regards. She said she'll be back later tonight. She has a sudden family matter,
Sharon said, relaying a message from her best friend. Vano nodded slowly. No wonder when he woke up, there was only Sharon who accompanied him. Not long after, the door to Vano's room opened. Revan and Vien entered together. Revan and Vien looked relieved to see Vano, who was already conscious.
You're okay, right?
Revan asked after standing next to Sharon. Vano smiled and nodded.
I'm fine, Pa.
Vano replied. Vano then looked at Vien, who didn't look good. Vien then looked at his father, giving the code to go out for a while.
Revan also invited Sharon to get out of there, letting Vien explain everything to Vano.
Sharon was not told by Revan who the culprit was who had hospitalized Vano. However, she was very surprised when she attended the trial and found out who the culprit was. It was Dilla, her husband's ex-wife. What Dilla did was not considered too dangerous by the judge, so she only received a 6-month sentence. Revan had objected, but he was persuaded when his former father-in-law made a promise. After the trial, Dilla's father asked to speak with Revan, Sharon, and his 2 grandchildren. They gathered at a restaurant close to the courthouse. Dilla, meanwhile, has been taken by the police and will be detained for the next 6 months. Tony, Dilla's biological father, regretted his daughter's behavior. He had no idea that his daughter had been disrupting Revan's household all this time. Tony thought that after divorcing Bayou, Dilla was just trying to heal her heart. Little did he know that Dilla had been disrupting Revan's life all this time.
I really apologize for what Dilla has done. I also didn't expect her to be that desperate,
said Tony. He was ashamed of Revan, who had been so kind to accept his daughter's situation, but was betrayed and left alone with the responsibility of 2 children who were not his flesh and blood. And now, Dilla was bothering him again.
Then why did you ask for leniency? Mama should have been punished longer so she could think better.
Vano said unhappily. Come on. He was the victim of his own mother's crime, and Vano still couldn't believe it.
Vano, Vien, Grandpa promised to take your mom away after she's released. I'll make sure she never interferes with your lives again,
Tony said. He is sometimes sad when he knows his daughter is not loved like a mother by his grandchildren. Unfortunately, it's all because of her own children.
That's good. We're tired, Grandpa. Mom is really stubborn and selfish. She just left us and came back after 10 years and made a scene,
said Vien. Here, it was Sharon who made him feel ashamed. How could she not? The woman who tried to harm Sharon was her own biological mother. Sharon, meanwhile, had always been kind to him and Vano.
Grandpa knows I apologize on behalf of your mother. Don't forget to keep praying for your mother so that she can change for the better,"
replied Tony.
After making this promise, Tony took his leave.
Her pride was trampled on because of Dilla's behavior.
He was embarrassed in front of his own grandchildren.
Forgive us, Dad. We're still troubling you.
Vano suddenly spoke in a guilty tone, his head lowered, too ashamed of Sharon.
Don't be like that. Papa is happy that you now know how your mother really is. Yes, even Papa was surprised that your mom would go to such lengths.
Revan replied. He then looked at Sharon and put his arm around her. He knew that Sharon was still shocked when she found out that Dilla was trying to harm her. The waiter came with their order. Tony's black coffee was served without being drunk because the owner had left before enjoying it. Perhaps he was in a hurry. Revan diverted the discussion from Dilla's problem to the subject of his 2 children's university studies and his wife. Revan also discussed the jobs his 2 sons would have in the company. He had high hopes for both of them to lead the company one day if Darren chose to retire. Week after week passed by Sharon so well.
She didn't feel worried that she would be bothered by Dilla again.
Sharon heard the news that Dilla was free when she was already heavily pregnant. However, she wasn't worried because Tony immediately sent Dilla abroad. I don't know why, but Sharon was relieved. At least during her pregnancy, she wasn't worried anymore. Today, exactly 5 hours ago, Sharon gave birth to her babies, twin girls. This was a surprise, because during the ultrasound, the doctor never mentioned this problem.
It was as if one of Sharon's babies was hiding.
This was quite a shock to the doctors and nurses who handled Sharon. But fortunately, Sharon's normal labor went smoothly without any obstacles. Although there was one sudden thing, Sharon gave birth to 2 babies, Sayakilla Arva Wijaya and Raisa Arvia Wijaya. Revan had special names for his 2 daughters. He cried tears of joy when his 2 babies were born into the world safely and healthily without missing a beat. His wish to have a child, his own flesh and blood, is now fulfilled with the help of Sharon, who is willing to carry and give birth to his child, being a mother to her children. Now in Sharon's room was Revan and the twins, who welcomed the presence of the other twins with great enthusiasm. They immediately wanted to try to hold the newborn siblings.
Sharon, who was still lying on the patient bed, laughed softly at Vano and Vien's enthusiasm.
Her attention was then diverted when Revan grasped her hand very tightly. The man's eyes were still teary.
Thank you so much. You have made my life perfect.
Revan whispered.
He kissed the back of Sharon's hand many times,
not forgetting to express his gratitude for what he got today.
You're welcome, Moss. I also thank you for accepting me as I am. I'm sorry for troubling you so much, Mass.
Revan laughed softly. Then he got up and kissed Sharon's forehead very gently. Vano and Vien smiled at the great affection between Revan and Sharon. Then they turned around as Revan kissed Sharon on the lips. Vano and Vien's faces looked upset because of their father's actions in front of them. Sharon, meanwhile, laughed amusedly at Vano and Vien's reaction. Yes, although she also felt embarrassed. Their happiness is now perfect. The presence of Sayakilla and Raisa completed their family. Not only Revan and Sharon were happy, but Vano and Vien too. Sharon now has the happy family she's always wanted. The same goes for Revan, and they both promised that they would always stay together, so that the sad past that Sharon had experienced would not be repeated in the lives of their children.